But the Supreme Court will be busy this term because it looks like they're going to overturn Roe v. Wade.
Okay, Robert, explain this to me, because I'm the Canadian. I'm seeing it from far away. I remember once upon a time, everyone was saying Roe v. Wade is not on the table, will never be on the table, and now we're in a world where Roe v. Wade is on the table. How did we get here? I know that I don't understand it enough to know how it got here. How did we get here?
So the Roe itself was always a problematic decision. Not many people vouch for its internal logic, its historical accuracy, or its legal precepts. Because really what Roe was is we want doctors to have the right to recommend and do abortions. It was not about protecting women's right to privacy. It just wasn't. If you dig into the history of it, and you know who Brennan was, used to be counsel to medical institutions, et cetera. If you know the whole history of it, you know where maybe it's Blackman I'm thinking of. That then you know that's what it was more of a eugenics type decision, frankly, than it was a bodily autonomy type decision. Then but Roe was basically created a trimester-based structure. The state could not do much in the first trimester, could do a little more in the second trimester, and couldn't do really, and could do a lot more in the third trimester. So the later in the pregnancy, the greater the state's rights to regulate abortion was.
Yeah, in terms of prohibition is what you meant.
Correct. Okay. And other restrictions. Then Casey came along, and that was where Reagan and Poppy Bush's appointees, who were supposed to overturn Roe, who had decades of tens of millions of evangelical voters voting for them and pro-life Catholics voting for them solely on the basis that they were going to overturn Roe, their appointees saved Roe. But they came up with another even more unmanageable standard, which basically made viability the standard, which is as soon as a fetus is viable outside of the womb, then the state can regulate it, even prohibit it. But before then, it would be presumed that it was invalid, the regulation or prohibition, unless it met certain unequal burden. A lot of these tests that became unmanageable tests. Since then, because those tests have been unmanageable and have created a lot of confusion and chaos in the lower courts, and more states have aggressively challenged it, the belief was that at some point they would likely back off of Casey's reinterpretation of Roe. But what happened? The state of Mississippi passed a law banning abortion after 15 weeks. Now they've passed another law that's, I think, 6 weeks. Heartbeat bill, which, by the way, what's unknown out there is the heartbeat bill is very popular. When you tell people, do you think abortion should no longer be legal once the baby has a heartbeat, a detectable heartbeat, most Americans say it should be illegal from that stage forward. Now, many of those Americans don't know how early that occurs in the pregnancy. But the assumptions about unpopularity are media-based fictions on the issue. A complete ban on abortion for any reason has never had majority support, but nor has the current position we're in currently, which allows it even in the third trimester in some states. So the Mississippi case goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court. They heard oral argument this week on the case, and the assumption was that while Barrett and Kavanaugh were shaky on other areas of Trump voters' concerns, that they, as coming from conservative religious traditions, would be good on the issue of questioning whether Roe should be the law of the land. And in particular, saying that if it's pre-viability, you're basically not allowed to limit abortion for the most part. And that was the initial issue that went up on cert. But in the merits briefing, everybody ended up focusing on should Roe be overturned or not. And this is partially the product of a mistake, in my view, tactical mistake by the pro-choice crowd. They decided to say you can't go along with the Mississippi case without overturning Roe, thinking that would get get 5 justices on their side. Instead, they welcomed it and said, you're right. Maybe it's time to revisit Roe. And the nature of the questions asked are that even liberal commentators believe that Roe will be overturned. The only question is, what does the new legal landscape looks like? Roberts is trying to say, let's say, get rid of viability as a standard. It's no longer a manageable standard. It's no longer consistent. Roberts made the point. He goes, right now, our abortion laws, there's only 2 other nations in the world that have our kind of abortion laws, and they're North Korea and China. And maybe that's not who we want to be in conformity with. That's because most countries in the world ban abortion after the first trimester at some level, make it very difficult after 12.
Except Canada, just as a side note. But Canada's
right there with North Korea and China.
I don't know when it becomes I don't know when it becomes illegal in Canada, but I think we have very, very few laws, and it's not as much of a political litmus test as it is in the States. I just know that we don't have much regulation whatsoever.
Yeah, it's because Canada doesn't have a real big Catholic or evangelical Christian population, or as much as the United States and large parts of Europe and other parts in Latin America, et cetera. So Robert's position was, we can move this up to something probably close to the end of the first trimester. Scrap. So that's why Roe would be overturned on its viability standard for when the state can intervene. He would move up the date, but protect it before then. The problem was he was the only one. I mean, the problem was for the people on the pro-choice side, or the people who would be okay with that compromise, is he was the only one articulating that. The three liberal Democratic justices were just whining and whining about how stare decisis is so important and precedent. These justices, who have no problem overturning any precedent they don't like, suddenly precedent is holy. Precedent is sacrosanct. If you go against precedent, it means you're political. And Justice Sotomayor, talking about, we don't want to be perceived as political. What world do these justices live in? Everybody knows they're political hacks.
Robert, they live in their own vacuum. I mean, they live in their own silo. Either they don't understand that they are already perceived as political, or they think it's righteous political. That's the only explanation.
So, but what Barrett and it's clear Gorsuch, Alito, and Thomas are ready to toss it. And Alito and Thomas always have been. Thomas asked more questions than he normally does. He was making a point that was, I think, part substantive, part rhetorical. He wanted them to tell him which part of the Constitution gives the right to abortion. Which one is it? Is it right to liberty? Is it right to personal autonomy? Or right to bodily integrity? And where is that right? Is that the liberty interest under the 14th Amendment? Is it a certain degree of private sphere under the 4th Amendment? Is it something else? Well, what is it? And of course, different people have different answers, which was his point, which is that nobody can even articulate exactly where abortion rights come in. Now, I think privacy and bodily autonomy have always been there. They're core to the If you don't own your own body, what do you own? So I've never agreed with Thomas and others that this doesn't come within that. The question is whether or not there's another life that you can protect. And that's a medical question. And then that leads to the second argument that Kavanaugh made. Kavanaugh has made clear he wants to return this to the states, so that that his new post-Roe landscape would be Robert's post-Roe landscape would be abortion okay up until 15 weeks, maybe even move it back to 12 weeks, but somewhere in that neighborhood is where he would have it. But that only gets 4, so that puts Gorsuch, Alito, and Thomas want to say no more. Period.
Stop actually right there. No more period means leave it to the states to decide?
No, I mean, I think they would be okay with that, but they mean that there's no constitutional right to an abortion. To a certain degree, it would mean leave it to the states. But at some point, if you believe life begins at conception, you could ban abortion, period. And in fact, you would say it's constitutionally required to protect innocent life. So, but I don't think there's not 5 votes for that. So in the end, what appears to be 5 votes for is to send it back to the states. Gorsuch and Alito and Thomas would be fine with that. Kavanaugh kept making that point repeatedly. Why? It was like, this is such a political issue. And I think he asked the right question, or a right question in this debate, which has always been, one question is, when does life begin in terms of protection of life constitutionally? But the other question is, who should decide that? Should the Supreme Court of the United States decide that? Should Congress decide that? Should the state legislators decide that? Who should decide that? And Kavanaugh's point was, this should not be a Supreme Court decision. This should be up to each state legislature to determine when life begins. And if they decide it begins at conception, they can ban abortion from period. If they think it starts at 6 weeks or 10 weeks or 50, they can do whatever they want.
And so the bottom line to that, to simplify it for a dummy like me, is leave it to the states. They say abortion is not constitutionally protected. Every state can enact their own laws. If you don't like the law of your state, move. It would be the bottom line. And
Correct.
if you and
you
if it
could go
gets,
to another state for those purposes.
and if it gets ratified as law in a state, that reflects the will of the people. Abortion laws are no different than gun laws. It's just what the people will by way of law. And if you don't like it, leave. Is effectively the argument.
Yes. And so the key vote is likely going to be Barrett. And Barrett's focus was a lot of the concern about abortion originally was the burden of parenthood. And she was like, these days you can put up a kid for adoption right away. And so, and that's very easy. Now she's familiar with this because she herself has adopted multiple kids. And so she was trying to argue that the reason for respecting the tradition of Roe it isn't applicable anymore because some of the arguments in both Roe and Casey no longer apply. Not only do we know a lot more about pain and more about the life of the fetus than we did back then, but we also now have all that you're really asking is you're saying the burden of the pregnancy is all you're asking the woman to bear by banning abortion. You're not asking her to bear the burden of parenthood because of the availability of adoption and how easy that is now available in the modern age. But that tells you where she's going. She's going to overturn Roe. The question is, does she join Roberts and say the states can't do it, but except after 15 weeks, or does she join Kavanaugh and the three conservatives and say it's the state period, you can ban it whenever you want, it's up to each state? But I think my prediction, they're going to send it back to the states fully. Barrett will ultimately sign on with Kavanaugh's decision. Not a guarantee, though, because I'm a big skeptic of Barrett and her fear of the political tea leaves. Barrett did mention, by the way, the vaccination issue in the context of bodily integrity. So people were trying. It was interesting. I mean, the same people pushing a woman's absolute right to terminate a pregnancy at any time. That's what a lot of their positions are.
Bodily autonomy.
Yeah, the bodily autonomy and personal integrity and so forth, bodily integrity, are the same people who are for vaccine mandates. Notably, they didn't respond at all to Barrett putting that out there. So but where that you never know where that goes. Barrett may be intending that to mean this a state can impose a vaccine mandate because bodily integrity doesn't mean that much. That may be where she's going. And so I think ultimately they're probably most likely they send it back to the states. There's a decent chance Barrett capitulates, goes with Roberts, and they just move the deadline to 15 weeks. But viability, I don't believe there's any more legal viability to the viability standard of Roe remaining controlling precedent by next year.
I had a question about Amy Coney Barrett. It was that there were some articles accusing her, and I'm trying to make sense of the accusation of racism by raising the argument that adoption is readily available as an argument against abortion, given her adoption of of African children. I still don't even understand the accusation against her. I'm trying to understand.
Well, it's confession through projection because they kept hammering how critical it is to have abortion available for poor people. And at some point you have to ask yourself, is that because they're concerned about poor people? Or is that because they think like Bill Gates and don't want poor people having more kids and don't want certain minority groups having more kids? Because that was the history of Planned Parenthood and Margaret Sanger. So that aspect, the pro-choice community has never dealt meaningfully with the eugenics and racist and elitist heritage of abortion supporters in America. And it goes way back. And I've dealt with it in person with high-ranking officials at Planned Parenthood. So but I think that a lot of people think it would never be overturned. I think they're wrong. It will be overturned. The only question is it moved to 15 weeks or is it moved to the states entirely? And I'm betting it's probably going to get moved to the states entirely. And I'll discuss the political implications of that with Richard Barris either tomorrow or next week, whenever he's available, because it's not what people think it is. There's some Democrats that think it's a big winner if Roe gets overturned at the Supreme Court. I think they're wrong.
And Robert, I want to bring this up. I hear someone screaming upstairs, and I don't know if it's joy or sadness. I'm going to leave. Marion is parenting right now. We're streaming. Rob, this is my question also. Nancy says, I've known two people who almost died from pregnancy, preeclampsia and hemorrhage. I don't like the idea of forcing someone to risk their life for another. So here's the question: are there any hard exceptions? Risk of life to the mother, rape, and or potential or diagnosed deformations or issues with the baby. Are those issues at play in the current debate?
Not before the Supreme Court. It's it's what the states can do, and whether the state chooses to have exceptions for when the pregnancy is not the result of consensual activity, which would be rape, incest. Whether self-defense is applicable, because that's what that person's talking about, a version of self-defense. With even though it's innocent life, they're not trying to cause you risk, but that's the theory by the health and well-being and life of the mother. And if people think it through, this gets real tricky philosophically and legally too. But when exactly is self-defense permissible? What if your life depends on you shooting an innocent person? That's one of those classic moral philosophy questions, because that's kind of when people say, I don't feel comfortable with the pregnancy risk, the health risk of pregnancy. If you accept that most of those people are saying that the fetal life is not the same as the woman's life. They're making a moral biological judgment, whether they realize it or not. I think at least unconsciously that's taking place, because otherwise, if you see the fetal life is the same as a human life, no different, then you have a very vulnerable life for which, if it's not a case of non-consent producing the pregnancy, then consensual activity to produce the pregnancy. At that point, is it okay to just shoot an innocent person to save your own life? Those kind of things, like hypothetically, they happen in certain wars and certain circumstances, but that's not an easy. I find that's actually a very difficult debate that most people have, because they go back and forth. But most people in the abortion context, down deep, either see the fetal life as equal to other human life, or they see it as some form of lesser human life, whether they fully appreciate that or not.
I'm only speaking from my own perspective, or potentially equal but causally dependent. And so I don't know if causally dependent means.
Yeah, that's the sophisticated feminist argument. There's a sophisticated feminist argument that goes, you are brought in, somebody needs your blood and organs to live, and you're the only one that can do it. Could the state compel you to go for 9 months and have your blood and organs used for this other purpose?
and risk your own hypothetically,
and risk your own life in the process. Now the difference is, if it's the product of consensual activity, where that's a known outcome, known possible consequence. I've been on the side of that's different. Especially in the way we treat child support laws, we say, hey, you're responsible. Even though you didn't control what happened during the pregnancy process, and maybe you didn't want to, get. Maybe you thought it couldn't happen. It did. My baby sister was born that way. My mom had one idea. My dad had another. Mom won out.
As was one of my brothers. Just throwing that out there, not a risk to life, but it was a total accident. Just happened because of accidents.
Yeah, my mom intended it to happen. My dad just didn't know she intended it to happen. But the peanut princess was born, my little sister. So I think the nature of it gets into a lot of deep moral philosophical questions. And Kavanaugh's point was, isn't that more appropriate for the Democratic legislative bodies at the most local level to determine? Because these are such deep philosophical, moral, religious, spiritual questions where there's robust debate about. Sotomayor tried to pretend there was no debate in the science. Just not true. She also pretended that the only people who believe life begins at conception are religious. Also not true. It gives you an idea for what little tiny cubicle of a world that she lives in. The same one where she's the only apolitical justice on the court. It's that same fantasy land.
It's called a silo, Robert.
Yes, exactly. But I think Roe is gone. Roe is on life support. And I think they're going to pull the plug by the end of 2022.
And I'm going to say
it'll probably be an issue right in the middle of the elections. They'll probably announce the case sometime in late spring, early summer.
And I have lived now through an era where even the people on the left are going to say our conspiracy theories have come to fruition. When everyone told us Roe versus Wade was never on the table 2 years ago, lo and behold, it's on the table. And now most people are saying it's going to be overturned. Robert, I'm going to bring this one up. I don't expect us to do it in unison, and I don't want us to because that would be total cringe. But my 2-year-old keeps saying, "Hi, Viva, hi, Robert," and waving at you guys. Would you guys wave back at the camera and say, "Hi, Lex," please? Hi, Lex. And
Hi,
now
Lex.
Robert. Hi, Lex. Enjoy the evening and well done because
oh, that's good. That's good. Double check that to make sure that wasn't a prank. Because but hi, Lex is fine. Yes. Otherwise, that name could have been. We could have been, Simpson style pranked.
I read it first, Robert. That one I read through first. Okay, so that is phenomenally interesting, and I do feel like I'm living through. I have my opinions on the matter. Nobody gives a rat's behind about my opinions. But it's interesting. I can see now how people on the left are going to say, "You called us conspiracy theorists 2 years ago. Look who's laughing now." But I also know what I know about Roe v. Wade's origins and how it might not have ought to have become law that it became regardless.